cancer NCD-related programs. So starting this year, as our leadership and funding comes under the Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industry in Japan, we're working more closely even with METI. They're working on a project with the OECD on health management and well-being. So the focus of this study is, as you can see on the tree on the right side, to look at healthy aging, connection within society, leaving no one behind, health management, safe and secure living, meaningful life, and inclusion and diversity. And the goal is to set up international standards, so ISO is for international standards, to be published. They now, after conducting the survey in Japan with 180 questions, want to roll out this survey in Thailand and potentially in Indonesia later this year. However, we'd have to adapt it both the language and then also contextually, because a survey with 180 questions may be difficult for companies in these other countries to respond to. So I'm going to shift to the second part of my talk, and this is probably a refresher for most of you as you've had basic biostatistics, but this is sort of just to lay the scene for then the examples that I'll be giving in cohort and consortia studies. So some of the key measurements, I was a little bit surprised that in the word cloud, with the link that I had sent, no one had mentioned infant mortality. So of course, mortality as a whole is important, and you think of adults, but infant mortality is still an important indicator. So this is the number of deaths per infant of infants under 1 per 100 births in a year. And neonatal mortality is then for the even smaller children, so those under 28 days. Under 5 is also still a critical measure because of not just in that first year of life, but also under 5, what happens in terms of survival rates. Life expectancy, I saw several people mention that, and I think in the second part of this lecture by Shuhei, we'll be hearing more about life expectancy and how those measurements then are used for global comparisons. Maternal mortality ratio is the number of women who die due to pregnancy or birth-related complications per 100,000 live births in a year. Unfortunately, this number is still quite high in developing countries and also in countries like the US. It's shockingly high. This also has to do with the healthcare systems. So it's not only in terms of the income level of the country, but also how the system is structured, the access of the individuals. And this touches on equity and also on gender equality. So a few more basic measurements to cover the mortality rate. Again, this will be discussed in more detail in the second part, the accrued death rate, age-specific death rate, morbidity measures. So several people mentioned incidence, prevalence, and DALYs. And then the population at risk, just as a refresher, so it's the denominator for calculating rates of incidence and prevalence. So if you look at the top right corner, if you have the total population, but you're interested, say, in breast cancer, cervical cancer, you'd only look at the women. And you wouldn't look at children, but you'd want to look at the age group that is most at risk, so 25 to 69-year-olds. This is both for measuring, but this is also then for policy implementation on programs such as screening, where the funding goes, resource management. So this is why it's important to understand these basic concepts and how these then get translated down the road and upstream for the governments and ministries of health. So a brief Zoom poll. Which global health indicator do you think is the most important? A, life expectancy, B, infant mortality rate, C, prevalence of diseases, or D, all of the above. So I'm just gonna click.
Sarah, sorry, there is an issue. I think that the Zoom we're using now is a bit different than our usual Zoom. It doesn't have I think what we can do is if it's A, react with I think we can play around with the react option. So I think for A, use the thumbs up. If it's B, I'm just gonna write it. Okay. If you answer A, thumbs up. B, heart. C, laugh. And D, what do I have left? Clap. Let's see, I think that should work. So if you want to answer A, life expectancy, choose thumbs up. If you answer B, infant mortality rate, use the react heart. C, laugh, and D, clap. So yeah, let's give it a try. Anyone? Please use the react option.
The react off option on? If not, that's okay too.
Yeah, it's on the on their
Clap. Okay. Thank you. We'll just give it another minute. So you can put your reactions. There you go. Clap. Okay.
Yeah, you can put it on the chat or you can use the react. I think chat is better. Yeah. I think you can see.
I see lots of people clapping.
So it's D.
I'd say that's an overwhelming D. Anyone else? And it's correct. You're welcome to still continue putting in reactions if you want. But the correct answer is D. So all of them are important, and they're important for different reasons. So for life expectancy, it also shows improvements. The prevalence of disease is important for resource allocation, but the interaction, so all of the above individually, but then also collectively are very important for making public health policy, for resource allocation, and for measuring change and also improving the health of the people. So a balanced approach is ideal. So thank you to those of you who participated, and we'll continue here. So the WHO's Global Health Observatory is one of the data resources. We'll be hearing more from the GBD, which is sort of the standardized global health measurement database. And here I'd just like to give some examples on life expectancy at birth. So on the bottom right side, you can see the different regions. You can see the Western Pacific actually has the longest life expectancy. This may be driven by Japan. And Southeast Asia in orange, then highlighted at the bottom by country. You can see Indonesia's life expectancy is actually among the shorter ones in the region. But again, there's differences between Jakarta and other areas, and particularly in Indonesia, because there's 17,000 islands, and there's some very poor and some very wealthy areas. This life expectancy, if you look at it by region, also by gender likely, will vary. Here are just some different measurements from the WHO 2024 World Statistics, so focused also on SDGs. And I'm not going to go into detail, but it's to show how you can present these life expectancies in different ways. So on the top left, you can look at it by region, also with Haley. I think we'll hear about that later. On the top right, then it's by income group. And then the bottom left is the global MMR, so the mortality rates, also with a confidence interval. And this is for the different time periods, so by time trend. And I'm just introducing this so that when you're conducting your own studies, particularly for undergrad studies, maybe you're looking at more descriptive studies, please do consider these different aspects. So the different area, whether it's urban, rural, or different regions. If you're looking at a global perspective, the income levels, you can use the World Bank income levels over time, and then also different types of measurements. So not this overall mortality for adults, but also under 5. So the bottom right side is actually the mortality for under 5, and then also NMR is the neonatal mortality. So you can compare these differences. And it's important not to just have one number stand alone, but to compare it with a different one for reference. So for life expectancy, again, looking at it from a gender perspective is incredibly important. So you can see for each country, there's a huge gap between men and women. Actually, women tend to live longer than men. And when you're creating health policy programs or also interventions for screening programs, you need to consider these factors, the gender differences. This is an easy example because the gender differences you can see in terms of quantifiable numbers, but it's not always that evident. And also, for example, with drug doses, most of the clinical trials are still among adult men, and so women, the dosage isn't necessarily adapted to women specifically, or also other programs aren't evaluated specifically by sex, so separate from men and women. If you look at the population as a whole, for example, for nutrition studies, not just the amount they eat, but what they eat, how they eat it is quite different. So this is just a reminder to look at studies from a gender perspective too. A few additional health measurements and also surveys. So in addition to WHO, the STEPS program, you also have DHS, the demographic and health surveys. This is open data that you can request or also mix the multi-indicator cluster survey. And especially for descriptive or cross-sectional studies, this is really important data where you can get a baseline understanding of what's happening in the country. If there's multiple surveys, you can also look at it over time, although sometimes the questions differ and the participants may differ. So it's not like a cohort study. So in the next part, I'd like to introduce cohort studies and my experience working with the Japanese cohort study, which is a long-term cohort study with closed data. So this is a little bit more difficult to access, but also includes very rich data. So cohort studies are a type of observational studies. There's prospective and retrospective. So retrospective would be looking back and prospective is looking forward. You have birth cohorts that start sometimes in vitro or from when a baby is born. And then you also have adult or even aging cohorts that start at different age groups. And you look at the study population as a whole, and then you look at the exposed groups, so say with smoking, so people who smoke and unexposed, people who don't smoke. And then you look at how often the event happens in the exposed group and how often it happens in the unexposed group. And unlike the surveys, the DHS surveys and things that are cross-sectional, where it's at one time point or measured in a different population at another time point in the same country, a cohort study follows the same group of people over time. So you know the exposure at the start or also maybe after 5 years, but then you're looking what kind of outcomes happen. So these may be cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia, different kinds of outcomes. So I'm actually going to use my PhD study as an example just to go into a bit more detail and highlight all of the complexities that are involved with conducting a long-term cohort study. So this is the Japan Public Health Center-based prospective cohort study with 140,000 participants. And it was started in the early 1990s, and there's two cohorts, so one in 1990 and one in 1993. And it's based in the public health centers, so it is relatively nationally representative with an urban and rural setting in each of these public health centers, all the way from not Hokkaido, the top island in Japan, but from Akita in the north, and then down to Okinawa in the south. It's still actually ongoing, and we have outcome data for cancer and cardiovascular disease, and there's expanded modules now for dementia, and also for ophthalmology, for dental health, not in the whole population, but in a portion of the population. And then in the next slides, I'm going to go over some of the exclusion criteria. So you think, oh, 140,000, that's great. We have this huge data set. But then actually, when you're looking at the more detailed nutrition data, for example, not everyone responded, or also the cancer incidence data, which is linked with the cancer registries. The setting in Tokyo, unfortunately, because so many people move out of Tokyo, has to be excluded from this analysis. So I'm going to go over it step by step, just so you have an understanding of research using cohort data. So this is an overview of the schedule, and it started in 1990. So in 1990, there was a baseline survey that included 130 nutrition questions alone, but then also various basic demographic questions. A portion of the sample, so the 20%, also had a blood sample drawn, and health checkups, so BMI measurements, hypertension, and basic health checkup. Followed up at 5 years and then at 10 years again with a questionnaire. So the questionnaire was given to all participants, and then the blood samples are only in 30% of the population. So if you're looking to use this kind of large cohort data, you have 140,000 at the start, and then at baseline, so these were 40 to 69-year-olds. We actually had to exclude some of the participants because they either didn't respond or they had moved, and we couldn't follow them up. So then at the 5-year follow-up, which is where we have the detailed nutrition data that I use, we had 121,000. And then the subjects who actually responded to the questionnaire were actually only 98,000. And then we had to exclude those who didn't respond to the questions that we were looking at. So in my case, my main exposure was rice, and the outcome was colorectal cancer. So anyone missing that data had to be excluded. So in the end, I only had 73,000 participants to analyze, which is still large, about half men and half women. But looking at the initial population of 140,000, this is clearly much less. And these participants were followed for 11 years. So the advantage of starting with an adult cohort is that the follow-up time might be 10 or 20 years, whereas if you start with the birth cohort, if you want to look at cancer outcomes, it would probably take 30, 40, 50 years to even get any kind of results that you could use for analysis. And it's very costly and difficult to follow people for such a long time. So if any of you are interested in nutrition and nutrition epidemiology, this is a whole field of research for itself. It is, of course, linked with general epidemiology, but starting with the food frequency questionnaires and then how these are validated. So these are very context specific, of course, the food items, and also the quantity, how much is eaten. So in our context, we asked 138 different food items, which were the most common food items in Japan in the 1990s. And for the exposure assessment, so rice consumption was asked as a frequency and then also as a portion size, so small, medium, or large. Some of the more detailed nutrition surveys might actually use photos or technology, but this was in the 1990s, so it was all still paper-based. And we used a residual method for energy adjustment. This was developed by Walter Willett at Harvard. Again, if you're interested for your graduate studies, maybe you can follow up on that. There's a great book on nutritional epidemiology by Walter Willett himself, actually. And we used median quartile values. So we divided the population separately for men and women into quartiles, quarters. And then the last point is the Spearman correlation. So this is to check the quality of the data between two FFQs, the food frequency questionnaire asked 1 year apart. So where the answer is relatively similar, so the higher it gets to 90, it's quite high. So this is 0.67 is sort of acceptable level, but not the highest. And for the follow-up, we used survival analysis. And so we used Cox proportional hazards ratios, and we used colorectal cancer incidence. So this is linked with the cancer registry. In Japan, these were located at the public health centers, and then in 2016, they were consolidated in Tokyo for a national one. And it's very difficult to access the data. So there's both pros and cons to having a national cancer registry. Of course, for standardization, it's good, but it makes it more difficult sometimes for accessing the data. And for the outcomes, we used the International Classification of Disease, ICD-10 oncology, so that these studies are also comparable with other studies from different settings. So this study was actually replicated in Hawaii a couple of years ago, and they could use the same coding then for their outcome for colorectal cancer, not just colorectal cancer as a whole. The last point, completeness for colorectal cancer, is how much information was picked up only from the death certificate. So for the cancer registry, you actually want to have it verified by a hospital. But some of it, of course, will only come from death certificates. And the higher that number is, the lower the quality of the data. So I'm going to shift a bit for this last part, moving from just a single cohort to a consortium of cohorts. So for the last 6 years, I've been working with the Asia Cohort Consortium. This is the largest consortium of cohort studies in the region. We now have 45 participating cohorts, and those in black, 33 cohorts have actually shared their raw data, which is housed at the National Cancer Center in Japan. And the JPHC study, which I introduced previously on the right bottom side, you can see it highlighted in red, is one of the cohorts joining. There's several cohorts from East Asia, from China, Korea, and Japan, and then you'll see several cohorts from Iran with a few in between. You can see that cohorts are clearly missing for Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and we're really hoping that in the next few years, decade, it takes time to establish these ongoing cohorts, both the funding and also the systems. But we hope that these types of population-based cohorts can also be established in Southeast Asia that have a different risk profile, that also have different genetics from East Asia and West Asia. So a bit on the history of ACC. It was launched 2004, so last year we celebrated our 20th anniversary. And originally the data was at Fred Hutch in the US, and in 2013 it moved to Japan at the National Cancer Center. And as mentioned, it's the largest consortium with cohorts from 11 countries participating. The original objectives were to clarify the relationship between lifestyle, environmental, and genetic factors. It's been difficult collecting the genetic factor data, even if it's available in some of the cohorts, due to national data sharing policies becoming more strict. And it's also to provide the professional support for pooled analysis of existing cohorts and to support the establishment of new cohorts. So under ACC, 4 new cohorts were established that also included genetic data. And these cohorts are finally maturing and yielding some of the outcomes and hoping to be included in future studies. The last point is also really important and has emerged more in the last years to train researchers in Asia through collaborative projects. So a lot of the training programs are based in the US or in Europe, particularly the English-speaking ones that are readily available. If they're in person, they're often expensive to attend, and if online, they're often not at a convenient time. So I've joined programs at 2 o'clock in the morning or ones that ran all night. So working within the Asian region to share training programs, to do fellowship exchanges, short-term programs for 3 months in Japan, and then also working with our partners in the Western Pacific. So in Australia, for example, is also almost in the same time zone. So it's 4 hours from Jakarta, 2 hours from Tokyo. This is a more detailed overview of the cohorts that are participating. So in alphabetical order from Bangladesh to Taiwan, with data for 1.5 million. So the cohorts don't share their full data set. They join on a project basis. But then if they share the basic module, then their data can also be used for future projects. And a couple of slides, I'll also introduce some of the actual projects. So I heard that some of you have been doing work on mortality, for example, cancer mortality. So this is data we have outcome incident mortality data for 268,000 and cancer mortality, so cancer deaths for 50,000, heart disease 24,000, and cerebrovascular disease for 23,000. Then looking at cancer incidence, so again, this all comes from verified registries in the different countries. We have site-specific cancer incidence for most of the major cancer sites, and then also looking at some, for example, ovarian and endometrial for women's health specifically. So in the recent years, we've done several reproductive factor studies looking at reproductive factors or birth cohort effect, parity, and ovarian cancer, endometrial cancer, breast cancer. And this is really important as this area globally has been under-researched, and particularly in Asia, the field of women's health is still emerging, and how it's also different from US studies and European ones. So the exposure data that we have quite a lot of diet-related variables, and currently the diet working group is actively harmonizing these variables. As you can imagine, the food is very different from country to country. How it was asked is also very different. So unlike the European study, EPIC, where each country uses the same questionnaire and might have some changes to their own foods, these are all unique individual cohorts that have different questionnaires, so it's quite challenging to harmonize this. For the family history of cancer, it's more simple because the survey just asks a binary question, some of it in more detail, but basically it's yes or no, family history of cancer. Medical conditions, sleep. So far, we've only published a study on sleep and mortality, but this is also an emerging hot topic, not just for cancer outcomes, but also, again, women's health or how it relates to nutrition. So I think in the coming years, we'll be expecting some more interesting studies on sleep. Smoking, of course, as the #1 risk factor for cancer, has been heavily researched, but also then as covariate or intermediary for other diseases and other risk factors. And then reproductive factors, as mentioned. So here are some of our recent publications from the last couple of years. Particularly the reproductive factor group was very productive in looking at the situation in Asia. Lung cancer, of course, is a hot topic, especially among Asian non-smokers and women. And so we've used some of the models that were developed in the US and then applied them in Asian populations. And now there's some new studies on diet and lung cancer, and then again looking at smokers and non-smokers. We're also working on smokeless tobacco, which is unique in the region, particularly in South Asia and Taiwan. So there's less data from the other countries, but at least some of our cohorts have some of the data. And so as one of the objectives of ACC was lifestyle, genetics, and environment. So if you look at the top right corner, our first major paper on environment, so long-term exposure to particulate matter and all-cause mortality was published last year. And we're hoping to use some of this data for future studies too, for planetary health, and also linking it with other risk factors. This was from our general membership meeting in Seoul last year. So the general membership meetings are usually held in an Asian country, and then in the spring, the working group meeting is held in partnership with the American Association for Cancer Research in the US, usually around April. So if you're interested, I'll share my slides later. The link for the commemorative book with more information on the consortium and how to get involved is at the bottom of this slide. So in the final section, I'd like to just touch on population attributable fraction, PAF. Probably most of you have heard of this to some extent, but again, I'm going to draw on my experience working on the updated Japanese PAF study and also how it compares with other countries. So PAF has various different importances. So for public health, it's to determine the proportion of disease cases in the population that can be attributed to specific risk factor. And for resource allocation, of course, prioritizing interventions that address the most impactful risk factors. And evaluating prevention strategies, so to estimate potential reduction of disease burden if certain risk factors are eliminated. So this really looks at not only the outcomes, so the disease, but also looks at the risk factors, and then from a prevention perspective, so from a policy, public health policy perspective, how to allocate the resources, and also how to prioritize the interventions to have the largest impact. And guiding health interventions, as mentioned. And then finally, understanding overall disease burden. So not just individual studies. So the previous studies that I introduced are mostly looking at an individual risk factor and an outcome, or maybe a few different covariates or stratified by men, women. But this is really understanding the overall disease burden in the population. And then one can also compare it between countries. So major studies have been produced in Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam, and Australia, UK, US, Canada, France, Germany, Brazil, Chile. Each country produces their own, so there's no standardized format which risk factors to look at or which risk factor and outcome pair. So for example, in Japan, gastric cancer is still considered a major cancer, and so you'd look at SALT in our study, whereas other countries where gastric cancer prevalence is relatively low may have not included that in their studies. But as you can see again, so for Southeast Asia, Vietnam is the only country that has a comprehensive PAF study. So maybe this is something for the University of Indonesia to take on. It's a fairly large multi-year project, and you need to have a strong team, big team of researchers involved in collecting both the prevalence data, the outcome data, the relative risks, and where data is missing, then borrowing from neighboring countries or regional or global estimates. So looking at Japan, this is the updated PAF study we conducted and published in 2022. You can see that infection it has the largest contribution, and it's divided by men and women. So the black bar at the top is for both sexes, and then the darker gray is men and lighter gray is for women, followed by active smoking, alcohol, and then highly salted foods, which isn't necessarily a main risk factor in other settings, or not as high. Salt consumption is or was still relatively high in Japan, but it's hopefully decreasing. And finally, to end with some challenges, so the data availability is a major issue, particularly I think in Southeast Asia. So not only the cancer incidence data, but also the quality of the data. So whether how reliable it is, and whether a pilot test has been conducted and also standardized, then so that it's comparable with other countries or also within the country. That global collaboration is important, so learning from other countries, the best practices, and also what kind of tools can be implemented. For future studies, a few recommendations. So using innovative approaches and technologies for measuring health, such as digital health. Some of these are also less costly and certainly more time efficient, but then also how to actually use and make use of the big data. And for Southeast Asia and Indonesia specifically, conducting some of these baseline surveys, setting up cohort studies, and then also PAF that are really critical for public health and long-term planning to improve the health of the people. So, terima kasih.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I think that was really useful. And I know this might sounds like refresh on epidemiology course, but I think that that is nice to learn. And I think this semester, all of you are doing research methods courses, and I hope that would inspire you to create your proposals. Anyway, Sarah, so I think for the Q&A, I'll just leave it in the back after Shuhei's lecture. All right, let's move on to the next speaker. So I'm going to share the profile from your from Keio, Shuhei. I hope that's all right, and you can feel free to add later for your introduction. So the next speaker is Shuhei Nomura, and I think you're just promoted as a professor recently. So congratulations. So Shuhei is based at the Research Centers and Institute, Keio University Global Research Institute. And I think similar to Sarah, you were affiliated with other institutions before, and where I met both of you was at the University of Tokyo. And I think you are still visiting scientist at the University of Tokyo as well. So, and Shuhei will be giving a lecture on global burden of disease. Shuhei, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ariska. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So again, thank you very much for having me today. I am Shuhei Nomura from Keio University. So as Riska mentioned, and also the Sarah has introduced some part of GBD, so I'd like to give you an overview of the big picture in global health based on the data from the GBD work. So, this lecture is actually like a part of a collaboration with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. We usually call it IHME, based at the University of Washington in Seattle. And so today's talk is, based on the data from this huge, the global project called the Global Burden of Disease Study, GBD. And IHME is, basically the one leading that GBD globally. And I'm sort of the lead for Japan side of the GBD. So this lecture is kind of part of that GBD work. The background, quickly, I'm a researcher, in academia, and I got my PhD in biostatistics from the Imperial College London in the UK in 2019. And there are many types of researchers in the world as an academia, and I do focus on applying research findings into shaping health policies and the strategies in the real world. So as a data scientist, I do often consider practical perspective, like how to prove if a given policy is effective or not, and also how to maximize the impact of the policies and the strategies. And this approach, helps us understand not just the theory, but also how to bring research into our real life. For example, in the last 7 or 8 years, I have been a consultant or the advisor to the major international organizations like Gates Foundation, WHO, and a few years ago, as a member of the committee that coordinate the health agenda for the G7 summit, hosted by the government of Japan, we made lots of policy recommendations to the ministries and high-level bureaucrats, the government people, which were then incorporated into the lots of summit outcome documents. And in terms of COVID-19, I have been the leader of the research group under the health ministry to continuously share data and evidence with the ministries, advisory board, etc. So, agenda of today, where we are now in global health. So my work is to create evidence to demonstrate this and guide health policy and guide strategies. Specifically, what are our country's health challenges now, and how much have we addressed that challenges in the last 10 years or the last 20 years, and how should we allocate limited resources, etc. That is my work. So I do generate sort of like such kind of evidence to help answer these questions. So let's start with a quick quiz. What do you think about the top 5 cause of mortality in low-income countries recently? Think about it for a bit. So this is for 2019, before the pandemic. The point of this quiz is that there are often gaps between what you think and reality. And we call this the knowledge gap. So you can answer this question in chat or in any way.
Yeah, I
I
think
can
you
give
can
you a
answer
30
in the
second
chat.
or 1 minute. Yeah.
Put your answer A, B, C, or D in the chat, and go ahead.
B, B. There are lots of participants, so it takes time to see every answers on the chat. B, B, D, D, C, A, question, A, D. Looks like A is now a majority, followed by B, C, D may have an equal distribution of answers. A, C. Okay, thank you. It looks like A can be a majority, followed by D or C. So the correct answer is C. A, which can be the majority of your answers, is low-income countries, but it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Very, very long years ago, you know. And the B is high-income countries in 2019. And D is lower middle-income countries. So you can imagine that if you are health minister of a low-income country or high-level bureaucrat, like the deputy director general, who is preparing next year's budget plan for health interventions. Or you can imagine, you know, you are the Japan, the foreign minister, or the high-level government people who is preparing a budget proposal for the next year's development assistance. So as your country minister, what health issues should you prioritize? Or as part of Japan's diplomatic strategy, what health issues should we prioritize in the development assistance? HIV/AIDS, malaria, nutrition for children or pregnant women, or chronic conditions or NCDs. So if you misunderstand even a single ranking, simple ranking of this kind of mortality, or in other words, if there was a knowledge gap, do you really think you could formulate appropriate, you know, health strategy or budget plan? Do you think you could allocate reasonable and limited budget? I do not think so. So that is the big challenge coming from knowledge gap. So let me introduce some key data and research work that help, you know, bridge this kind of knowledge gap. And this is a GBD, Global Burden of Disease Study. And I think some of you are already familiar with the GBD and heard about GBD. And GBD is, you know, the global effort that evaluate magnitude of health loss due to a variety of disease, injuries, and also risk factors, globally, nationally, and sometimes subnationally. And then this is a, you know, massive research collaboration based in Seattle in the United States, and with over 14,000 people from the, you know, more than 160 countries globally. And I'm a member of the GBD Scientific Council since 2000 something. And then this is the GBD principal concept. Every health metrics must be comparable and comprehensive. You know, for example, the mental health and some tropical medicine diseases, they are often less evaluated because researchers are more likely to focus on more popular outcomes that are relatively easy to calculate, estimate. Data collection is also easy, but GBD also address this kind of less attention to disease outcomes. And yeah, this is a good way to understand what GBD looks like. So on the left panel, we have a world map comparing various health metrics by country. And in the center, there is a ranking. And on the right panel, you can see health metrics divided by different age groups. So what do you think about this? So this looks like, the visualization of the overview of what health condition looks like in globally or nationally in the ranking, also between the different age groups. So this is what GBD looks like. And so in the GBD, we deal with a lot of health metrics. And you already learned a lot from the SARA. I didn't include it, infant mortality, etc. But broadly, the mortality are included in my slide. Incidence and prevalence, which may be familiar with you. So today, I want to talk about the important health concept called burden of disease. And the main metrics we use to measure this is, something like DARIS, or disability adjusted life years. So I will talk this in later. But let me quickly go over what this is. So DARI, I think many of you are indicated this measures in the thorough presentation. So I believe some of you already know about this. DARI is a pretty new health metrics of measuring health loss, but this has gotten a lot of attention in the last 10 years. So the key things about DARI is that they take into account not just when someone dies, but also how illness affects their life. For example, the mortality just counts death. But think about an illness that kills people quickly versus an illness that where people can live for 10 years or 20 years with treatment and then died. So they are both just seen as one death in mortality metric. But today it is pretty very usual for people to live with conditions like heart disease, diabetes, or cancers for many, many years. So this makes the quality of life or how long people live with these conditions really important when we think about health loss. And that is where GBD come in, So why focus on GBD? The great things about looking at the burden of disease is it tells us how health loss from several, disease can have a different meaning. So different health loss from the different angle in terms of dying and also in terms of living with illness. So studying disease burden help us compare how different disease affect various groups of people, like by location, by age group, by gender. So this makes it super powerful tool to understand what we should prioritize in health policies and strategies. And this is a history of GBD. It goes back in 30 years. So it originally started as a project by WHO and the World Bank, and the main goal was to address the knowledge gap. So initially, the coverage of the number of countries and disease, they were very not extensive. And then every few years, they update the data on different countries and regions and disease and risk factors. And also they publish a report on their findings. But a few years back, the GBD faced a lot of challenges. And the main issue was about coverage again. It was very quite limited, and GBD didn't have detailed data at the national level or the subnational levels. The subnational is like a prefecture, like Tokyo, Osaka, etc. So comparing the data across different areas was very, very challenging. And there was not, much information on how accurately the statistics were estimated. And most of these problems are coming from the weak data collection system globally and the limited the computation power, the PC. And a lack of people and experts who had deep understanding in the mathematics and the statistics. So, but in 2007, there was a major shift. There was a turning point. So as I said, GBD initially started under the WHO and World Bank framework, but in 2007, its research base was moving into the IHME at the University of Washington, and this move was significant. And the IHME's, funding, the research funding was supported by the Gates Foundation. And I believe many of you know about the Lancet. So this is one of the biggest names in the medical and health journals. And in 2012, the GBD was featured in a special series of the Lancet, and 7 papers were published and simultaneously, which provided around 1 billion of estimates and covered a wide range of health metrics, including diaries, mortality, and also risk factors for many countries. So many of the challenges in the GBD facing around 2000 or before, they have been addressed in recent years. So we have seen a big improvement in how much data can cover, which makes it easy to compare health metrics from different years. And also the coverage of disease and risk factors have increased. And importantly, more research for getting involved. As of today, there were more than 14,000 researchers from more than 160 countries. So since 2012, almost every year or every 2 years, we have been updating the estimate using the latest data, and we are continuously publishing some papers in the Lancet or other journal. And we are currently at the stage of publishing the latest estimate, including a COVID impact for the first time. It was just published last year. And then this year, 2025, we are preparing the new estimate for GBD 2023. And one of the things we value is transparency and replicability. So we make all of our analysis tool and the code publicly available. And all the details of our methodology are included in the appendix of our papers. And in addition, so we have many tools. The GBD Compare, which is a tool for visualizing our estimate, it enables various comparative analysis. And we focus on easy, understandable data collection, communication, everything for the general public. And also the GBD result tool allows users to download every estimate for any subset of data. Many studies have been conducted using this GBD data. So we encourage everybody here to use our data. This is free to download. And then GBD source tool, which shows what data we are using. So it allows users to see what kind of data is being used for which disease or which risk factor estimation in which countries, etc. And many, international organizations consider GBD as one of the benchmarks for decision making. I think, these are very popular organizations globally. UN system, public-private partnership, bank, Gates Foundation, philanthropy, etc. This is a part of them. So, okay, now let's move on to discussing how to measure DARIs. This is very important. So, as I said, the GBD use lots of health metrics, such as mortality, life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, in order to understand the impact of disease and injuries. Every indicator is important. And among these metrics, the three key indicators stand out, YLD, years living with disability, YLL, years of life lost, and then DARI, disability adjusted life years. And these terms might be unfamiliar to some of you. So let me go over them briefly. So think about the life of a person here. And this person, this person was born with expected lifespan, life expectancy. However, it is very, very common for people not to maintain the perfect health for their entire lives. And they may suffer, from various disease and injuries in their life, and they may even die from the disease or injuries earlier than expected. So in this situation, the period spending living with disabilities is highlighted in yellow part, which is called YLD, and the time lost due to dying earlier than expected, or which is called premature death, is highlighted in green, which is also known as YLL. Then, DARIs. This is one of the most important health metrics in the GBD. It is calculated by adding together YLD and YLL. So DARI provides a comprehensive measure of health that considers both the impact of living with disability and the effect of premature death. That's why GBD DARI is called comprehensive health measure. So let's go to some terminologies or other health metrics that you will need to know. So you might already be familiar with them, but just in case, well, let's start with life expectancy. So the life expectancy is how many more years a person is expected to live at a given age. It usually refers to the average years expected to live at the birth. And healthy life expectancy is the total life expectancy minus the time living with disability. So essentially, it is the time you can expect to live a healthy life. And also the severity of a disability plays a very important role in estimating YLD. For example, if you compare like a back pain to lung cancer, the impact of 1 year living with lung cancer is, significantly different from 1 year living with back pain. The YLD calculation takes these differences into account by assigning different disability weights to over, more than 300 different disease conditions. And in order to determine this disability weight value, the GBD conducted extensive research work, including face-to-face interviews and also internet surveys with, tens of thousands of people worldwide. For example, we asked a question to the people, between Mr. A with lung cancer and Mr. B with back pain, who do you think faces more severe health conditions? So by examining, a range of disease condition combinations throughout this kind of question, and we gather lots of responses, and we got important insight into public perception of various health conditions on, the people's lives. And finally, so we categorize the disease and injury into several groups. This is the first level of a hierarchy, which consists of 3 groups: communicable maternal and child disease for LET, and non-infectious diseases, NCDs for group B, and injuries for group C. And moving on to more detailed grouping, let's take the infectious disease like example, the malaria, HIV/AIDS, influenza, etc. So in policy making, the level of details needed varies depending on the people or the specific situation. So GBD provides estimated various level of details. For example, when deciding the allocation of governmental development assistance for health, so we first examine the epidemiological transition in the recipient countries. This helps us, determine which is more important to address, like non-communicable disease or infectious disease, which makes, the first or second level of detail more relevant. And similarly, for example, for the cancer epidemiologist, it's about focusing on, the types of cancer that are most significant, which corresponding to the third level or fourth level of the GBD, the called hierarchy. Okay, so I want to do some quick workshop. We have some time for the workshop. So we will be using the data from GBD 2021. As I mentioned earlier, GBD 2021 is the latest GBD estimate that has been published last year. So it covers 376 diseases and injuries and 99 risk factors. And it provided a lot of estimate. The total number of estimated parameters exceed 607 billions. So let's start by filling out this table. It is a ranking of top 10 cause of death in low-income countries. The term SDI here in the slide refers to the social economic indicator based on the income level, education level, where low SDI corresponding to what we commonly refer to as low-income countries. So please answer for the table for the year 2000, which is 20 years ago, and for 2021, the middle of the COVID pandemic. So again, the purpose of this workshop is to identify the knowledge gap you all might have. So I know that we don't have much time for the workshop, so you can individually think about this ranking. I can give you 1 or 2 minutes. You don't need to present your findings. You can just imagine the ranking in your hand. So you can choose the disease and injuries to include for the table from this list. I can give you 1 or 2 minutes. Think about it. Of course, if there are any volunteers to present your ideas, you can chat. Like you can say, not necessarily top 10, you can chat the top 3 or top 2 or reading cause of mortality in 2000 or 2021. And if possible, you can address what happened in the last 20 years in the ranking in low-income countries.
Please give your answers in the chat.
Yes, thank you. Once a couple of people answered on chat, we can start discussion.
Yeah, so some of you please give your answers in the chat. It could be a short summary of what you think, or you can just put the rankings of 2021, 1, 2, 3, and then 2000. Sorry. Yeah, basically like that. Don't be shy.
Any answers are welcome.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I see 2 people. I'll
Great.
4 more.
It's interesting.
Mm.
As of now, we have completely different ideas on the cause of this ranking. That's a very important point. Conflict. It largely depends on countries, but this is very, very important cause of this. The mixture of NCDs and infectious disease in 2000. Any other ideas?
Anyone else? Okay.
Interesting.
Mm.
Some people are thinking that 20 years ago, the majority of mortality ranking are fueled by infectious disease. And some people are thinking that 20 years ago, there was a double burden from NCDs and communicable disease. And other people are thinking that already NCDs are the majority of cause of death. Good. So let me show you the answer. This is the answer. So, I do think nobody has highlighted. No, yes, one person has highlighted. Neonatal disorder, main cause of death, in 20 years ago. And now, important mortality. So to be more precise, it includes things like complications from premature death or the circulatory disorders during childbirth, or the bacteria infections during labor. But mainly it is robust weight or premature death of babies that are caused by the malnutrition of mothers. So important point in 2000 was that there was a double burden already. Many of you are maybe are thinking that 20 years ago, low-income countries were affected by the communicable disease. But looking at the data, of course, infectious disease are important cause of this, but already some NCDs had joined as the top 10 cause of this ranking, stroke and ischemic disease. And then I could say that there was a big change in the cause structure in low-income countries. Many of the infectious disease were changing their ranking in downward. Like HIV/AIDS has disappeared out of the top 10, and tuberculosis also dropped its ranking, and diarrhea, which is also very, very important infectious disease due to unsafe sanitation or the water, etc. And then importantly, COVID was the leading cause of mortality in 2021 in low SDI countries. And you can see ischemic disease, it increased its relative ranking in mortality. So there was a big change in the disease structure in low SDI or low-income countries, and there was a double burden from infectious disease and NCDs. An important point is that mortality for each condition has decreased in the last 20 years, even after age standardization. So this is just a ranking, But the point is that health improvement in low-income countries was substantial. Mortality rate for each disease condition here showed a decrease in the last 20 years. But the structure has been changing. NCDs becoming more important, it's in relative rankings. But another point is neonatal disorder is still very, very important cause of death in LOSD countries. So given the limited time, I want to skip the high-income countries ranking. So this is the high-income countries, the mortality ranking, like Japan, US, and UK. Although there were a little bit difference between countries, but this is the overview of the cause of this ranking for high-income countries. So most of the deaths were caused by NCDs, cardiovascular disease and cancers, and also some respiratory disease like COPD or lower respiratory infections. And then I could say that there was not big change in the disease structure in high-income countries. Ischemic heart disease and stroke and lung cancer are still very important cause of mortality 20 years ago and now. And chronic kidney disease has increased its relative ranking. This is mostly due to the lifestyle change, like BMI situation, glucose situation. They are, that trend is worsening. That is the reason why chronic kidney disease has increased its relative ranking. So again, similar to low-income countries, population health has been improved in highest countries or high-income countries as well. Mortality rate for each condition has been decreased, even after age adjustment, except for CKD. CKD has been, worsening. This is a very important point. So let's think about DARIS. The previous workshop was for mortality, but now you can think about DARIS ranking, which incorporates both mortality aspect and disability aspect. So you can choose this disease and injuries list. I can give you again a couple of minutes to fill out this table 20 years ago and now in low-income countries for DARIS ranking. And please chat when you are ready to present your ideas.
If you're ready, put your answers in the chat.
Any ideas? Oh, Thank you. The neonatal disorder is highlighted by many of you. Low back pain, depressive disorder, which is a very, very important disability condition. Oh, Kuliah ranking has come. 2000, infectious disease, including injuries from road accident. And 2021, neonatal disorder still the leading cause of disease, followed by some important infectious disease, including 3 major infectious disease, and the congenital defect has come as important NCDs. Diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and again, neonatal disorders. Great. So this is the answer. So other COVID outcome, which include excess mortality and associated with the pandemic, excluding COVID itself and other infectious disease known to be associated with COVID-19. As I said, this is a kind of unknown, unexplained outcome after the pandemic. So the point is that neonatal disorder is the leading cause of diaries 20 years ago and today, followed by lots of important infectious disease, including major 3 infectious disease like malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. There are a bunch of improvement for 3 major infectious disease, but they are still top 10. This is a very, very important point. And then another important point is the NCDs have become a top 10, like a stroke. Another important point is that looking at both 2000 and 2021, most of the diseases are particularly occurring in children, affecting their lives. So looking at the diaries, they are composite index of disability and mortality. And then obviously the mortality part is more important in low-income countries as children were affected by the diseases. One death in children and one death in older people, the substantial change was the life lost. YLL part, which was calculated by the date of death minus life expectancy at birth minus date of death. That means if the children dies, YLD part is very big. So another point is that there was a substantial change in the ranking itself. HIV is decreased its relative ranking, tuberculosis as well. But some disease has become relative importance increase, like a stroke. Malaria is very tricky. Malaria is one of the disease which was influenced by the pandemic. Of course, the mortality or YLD or YLL, everything has decreased in the last 20 years. But malaria was a little bit, has different trend. Only after the pandemic, its mortality has increased a little bit. So high SDI, I could say, there was a very important non-fatal outcome has jumping in the top 10 ranking in 2000, also 2021, like a low back pain, depressive disorder. I think some of them are already highlighted in some of you. So they are very important. They are not fatal, but causing a lot of burden in the population. Low back pain can be surprising to you. This is not fatal, but given the large number of people who are suffering from back pain, and given the large number of people And then the total size of burden is very big, becoming a third cause of death in 2021. And then I want to highlight the importance of Alzheimer's disease. It's increasing due to the population aging. And another important cause is diabetes. Diabetes has increased its, deaths even after age standardization. That means even the younger people are worsening in the conditions like diabetes. This is a very important point. So, I don't know how much time I can have, but I want to give you this quiz for Indonesia, which is most relevant to you. So I can give you 1 minute or 2 minutes. You can answer this quiz. So this is your countries. I don't have a much discussion on the outcome of the country's ranking, but my intention of this quiz is to, you can understand the knowledge gap. I often do this kind of workshop to the Japanese people, thinking about Japan's ranking of mortality or death, but there are a huge knowledge gap. Always. Any answers?
Please put your answers in the chat, like usual.
I know the answers. It is very complicated in Indonesia. Mhm. Many infectious disease and neonatal conditions, nutrition issues, and 2021 NCDs like ischemic disease, stroke, and diabetes. COVID, stroke, ischemic disease. Stroke, ischemic disease today, and COVID. Very poor burden. That's true. So I want to show you the answers. This is the answer. I believe you can understand why I said complicated. There are lots of transition in the mortality structure and disease structure in your country. Infectious disease and also child nutrition or maternal nutrition issues have decreased its relative importance. That is the very big change compared to other, lower middle income countries. COVID is the second leading cause of mortality, but point is that many non-NCDs have increased its relative ranking. Stroke and ischemic disease and diabetes has jumping in the top 10. And now I think some of you mentioned that there is a triple burden, nutrition, infectious disease like tuberculosis, and also NCDs. Stroke and ischemic disease, they are very popular in lots of countries now. And it is obvious there are lots of changing in the ranking. The dramatic change is happening in your country. Thank you very much. So before we go into the next, I'd like to make a point about the significance of disabilities in the context of health loss, or LD. So this slide shows the trend over the last 30 years in the burden of disease due to both disability and mortality. On the left side, especially in the low-income countries, you can see a dramatic decrease in the disease burden associated with mortality, or LL, by about the 50% reduction. But if you look into the right panel, you will see that there has been no big change in the burden of disability over the same period. This means that people in low-income countries are increasingly living with various diseases. Rather, the proportion of health loss attributable to disabilities is increasing. This is our risk factor ranking, but I want to skip this due to the limited time. So malnutrition is a leading risk factor contributing to diabetes, which is also corresponding to the leading one cause of diabetes as a neonatal disorders. And washing, this is also corresponding to the important cause of diabetes of diarrhea disease. And this is for high-income countries. Tobacco is the leading cause of diabetes, and followed by important metabolic risk factors like glucose level, BMI, or obesity, and blood pressure level. And there are some similarities between low-income countries and high-income countries, which is dietary risk. Unhealthy diet is a very important risk factor now. Indonesia, again, there was a big change in your countries. Risk factor profile has also changing dramatically in the last 20 years. Okay, so this is a summary of we have seen, we have covered so far. So globally, health conditions have improved, but we are now facing, lots of the new trends with increase in disabilities, including low-income countries. This is a key point, and particularly, concerning rise in the burden of disease like diabetes, mental disorders as well, among even the younger population. And, chronic disease conditions are becoming the more prevalent worldwide, and public health measures are insufficient to, stop the increase in potentially preventable risk factors like tobacco again, metabolic risk factors, so which leaves people globally vulnerable to health crisis like the COVID pandemic. Many metabolic risk factors were trigger for severe COVID-19 illness. Okay, so looking ahead, it is anticipated that healthcare system will face a rise in the demand for, generally more costly services for NCDs or chronic conditions, including non-fatal disease condition. So using the remaining maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I want to talk about where global health is headed. This is a quick quiz. Who do you think is involved in the global health? Any institutions or organizations come to mind?
Put them in the chat.
Yeah.
You can even say yourself.
That is a correct answer. Yourself is an important player in global health. WHO, WHO, WHO. The WHO? Okay. The word is simple. There is one only institution working on global health. WHO. I need other ideas. I understand you are very familiar with WHO. Government, great answer. US? Mm-hmm. Government. World Bank, UN system. Okay, so this is just example. UN system and also World Bank. There are sorry, there are lots of entities like Gates Foundation, MSF, Oxfam, and more recently, especially with regard to COVID pandemic, maybe you know of Gavi, which became a very important organization recently. And yeah, this is also true for my main, academic field, universities or think tank, etc. So the point is that the global health now has a lot of players, and it is an area experiencing significant growth. And there was actually a important turning point in global health. Have you heard of the MDGs? So about 20 years ago, in the year 2000, at the UN General Assembly, the member states adapted these goals as an objective for the next 15 years. And I think you have probably heard about the SDGs, which are, successor of the MDGs. And the key point here is, sorry, the key point is here is that among the 8 global goals of MDGs, there are directly related to health, which targeted infectious disease control, pregnant women health, and child health. So MDGs have often been described as a significant turning point in global health. So these targets are, related to what I showed earlier about the rankings in low-income countries where, neonatal disorders top the list, and also the infectious disease like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and the malaria are also the top 10 about 20 years ago, and some of which are even still top 10 in 2021, which indicated a global effort to intervene. And another quiz. So this graph shows our estimate of the trend in the amount of development aid. This is, aid, essentially supporting, this is the money for low-income countries or lower middle-income countries coming from donor countries like Japan. So please think about what each color might represent in terms of specific health sector, like malaria control, TB control, or reproductive health, or the non-communicable disease control. A hint would be like the MDG target. Since the year 2000, the world has increased its focus on fighting with infectious disease and maternal and child health because they were MDG's target. So what do you think about, for example, the bottom one, dark green? You can chat. What color do you think represent in terms of health sector? Particularly, what do you think about the bottom one, the dark green? In dark green, there was a substantial increase after 2000 when MDG has begun. Any ideas? No idea? HIV/AIDS? color is for, vaccine, HIVs. That is a very interesting point. Peach color is, the top one, which showed a substantial increase after 2000. This is COVID and other infectious disease. So HIV/AIDS is a major answer. That is correct. So the dark green at the bottom represent HIV/AIDS, which saw the most rapid increase after 2000. So this investment has significantly contributed to reducing the disease burden of HIV/AIDS in low-income countries by, nearly 70% cut of mortality over the 20 years. And then there is a purple representing in children and pregnant women, including, the promotion of free vaccination, infectious disease measures for children and prematernal care, education, training for midwives and gynecologists, and also improvement in the water and sanitation and nutrition, etc. And yeah, the pink color, the fresh pink color represents, COVID-19 measures. And one thing to note is that, since around 2010, the overall proportion of each color, each sector has remained relatively stable with no major change except for COVID. So you can remember non-communicable disease. In low-income countries, they accounted for about 30% of diaries now. And in lower middle-income countries, it's up to 60% of diaries. NCD burden has dramatically increased over the last 20 years. But in this graph, you see NCDs are represented by orange color and make up only about 1% of the total development assistance for health. So this could indicate that development aid by donor countries has not been able to keep pace with the rapid changing in the disease structure in low and lower middle income countries, as the data suggests. Okay, so let's think about Japan. So Japan is, one of the largest donor of development aid, and followed by the US and Germany in terms of the amount of funding provided for development support. And, Japan is one of the leading countries in health. And in response to the global expectations, Japan has hosted many international policy conferences, which helped shape the current global health trend. For example, Japan has contributed to infectious disease control by establishing and investing in international organizations like a Global Fund, which specifically targeted the three major infectious diseases like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And also Japan has been promoting some important visions, such as health should be equal, or health disparities should be eliminated. And, health is central to the human security. So this kind of the promotion of important vision on global health is often led by the Japanese government. And here is, I think, the final quiz. And this graph shows the investment in the global health within the framework of development aid. The left panel shows the total amount for health, and the right side, the percentage of the total development aid allocated for health. So where do you think Japan stands? In the previous slide, I said that Japan is promoting health is important. Japan has contributed to lots of important policy dialogues. Hosted G7 summit, G20 summit, UN high-level meeting. Japan did a lot. Then, looking at money, in terms of total amount, in terms of relative ranking out of total ODA, so where do you think Japan stands? This is before COVID. Any ideas? Your expectation is welcome. Any volunteers?
Please put your answers in the chat like usual.
The hint is that there was a lot of knowledge gap in the government of Japan. Okay, given the limited time, I have to go. I assume Japan could do second largest amount after this. Thank you. So the answer is that Japan ranks fourth in amount in 2019. So you don't need to apologize. After US and UK and Germany. But when looking at the percentage of the health sector, we can say Japan ranks closer to the bottom. Compared to the average of the G7 countries, Japan's contribution is about half. So, there are many sectors beyond health, including infrastructure, energy, education, humanitarian aid. So health was not a major sector in Japan's development aid, as the data shows. This surprised a lot of government people in Japan who were thinking Japan is the leading country to provide ODA for health. Then, this story goes back about 2 years, or no, 3 years. I think I mentioned that beginning that I have been focusing on policy engagement, and this is a clear example of that. So when Japan's global health strategy was being revised for the first time in the last 10 years, so I was a part of the expert committee involved in the process, and then we made a proposal to double the funding for global health. And this was, echoed by the proposal submitted by the ruling party of Japan. And eventually the proposal to double the funding was rejected by the government, but it was, decided to include an expansion of the budget. Those two are totally different. Double is a clear target, but expansion is very, vague term. But this is very good achievement. So this is a demonstration of the government's strong commitment to leading in global health. And the proposal to double the funding was based on my data as a benchmark, which showed that Japan's health ODA was only about half compared to the G7 average. So, it is critically important in policies to get something written down in strategy documents or policies. So once something is formalized in the writing, it becomes much easier to allocate the budget for it. In other words, issues or the topics not mentioned in the document do not receive funding. So that is why, stakeholder work so hard to include something they think important in policy documents. And the global health strategy also started to emphasize the increasing disease burden from the NCDs in low and lower middle income countries, which highlighted them as a, key area of a focus of ODA, in addition to infectious disease and maternal and child health. So this shift is based on the data-driven evidence, like the kind I have presented in this talk, which I think is fantastic. So lastly, I'd like to introduce an important database of ODA. This is not about GBD work. So since the revision of the global health strategy, there has been a significant demand for making ODA data more visible, including COVID-19 support money. And I have always wanted to do this. And finally, in December 2 years ago, I launched a dashboard I called this border. The methodology of the estimation was also published in the paper. So this creation of the visualization tool was funded by the Gates Foundation. This is what it looks like. It was from the materials used in the launch event. And so this shows how much money from 30 donor countries, including Japan, goes to which sector. There are 22 sectors, including health. And in the more detail, there are more than 200 subsectors, including COVID-19 support. I have prepared several tools, and what we launched at the end of the 2023 is called Flow Visualization. This is a tool that shows which organization or institution the fund are channeled through and how much goes to which sector or which recipient countries. And this is a ranking, and this is a trend. Lots of visualization tools are published. So, okay, to summarize, so the increase in ODA for health after MDGs has really energized global health. So the immediate challenge is that the past 20 years, both low-income countries and lower middle-income countries are experiencing a significant shift in disease structure, epidemiological transition, with a growing burden from chronic disease, NCDs. And there is a possibility that development aid from donor countries is not keeping up with that shift. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Suhei. That was really insightful. So without any delay, I think I'll just go directly into questions and answers. So I'll first ask the students, do you have any questions to both Sarah and Shuhei? Go ahead. And this is a very rare opportunity for you to ask questions to foreign experts, and I don't get to invite them very often. So please ask questions. You can ask very basic questions, don't worry about it. Or you if you feel like, okay, this is a very stupid question, no, don't feel like that. So go ahead. Maybe you can put them in the chat, but also you can raise your hand and speak directly.
Give me a second. I want to take some
Yeah.
drinks.
Okay, go ahead, Yuhei.
Thank you.
So yes, any questions, raise your hand. Don't be shy. Just think of it as a very rare opportunity for you to ask questions. And I don't get to invite many foreign experts a lot. So please ask your questions.
If I can just add, because I know maybe you're shy to talk in front of 300 people. I am too. So feel free to put it in the chat box. And also, if you don't have a question, maybe you can just put in your area of interest. So whether you're interested in nutrition or whether you're interested in malaria, infectious disease, just because that way Shuhei and I might have some ideas what we could talk about if you don't have a specific question. So you can just put in your area that you're interested in.
Yeah, there is one question from Tasha. Tasha, do you want to come forward and read your question?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Don't be shy. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I'm apologizing for not showing my face due to internet issues, but I'm Tasha from Class C. I have read a bit about the study of burden of cancer attributable to modifiable factors in Japan in 2015, which estimated how much of Japan's cancer burden in 2015 could be prevented by avoiding exposure to modifiable risk factor linked to lifestyle like smoking, alcohol, infection, poor diet, and lack of physical activity. And it is very interesting considering the population attributable fraction and its role in identifying preventable disease burdens like cancer by eliminating the exposure to certain risk factor. And how can Indonesia leverage this concept for more targeted, cost-effective health policies? Plus, because you're from area, I want to ask about additionally, should global health strategies be standardized, or is localizing approaches like Japan's data-driven model more effective? And how can Indonesia collaborate with institutions like area to strengthen evidence-based public health system? That's my question. Thank you for again for today's insightful session.
Tasha, thank you very much. Those are all very important questions. So I'll try to answer them one at a time. So starting with global or localized, ideally this should be localized. So at least at national level, and even within national level from DHS studies we've performed, particularly in South and Southeast Asia where there's a lot of inequality. So in Japan, there's fewer health inequalities, although they do exist. It's important also to do sub-regional analysis, urban, rural. But the situation in Japan, both from environmental, genetic, risk factor, is very different than in Indonesia. So at least at national level, these type of studies to provide useful evidence to the government should be done in country. So localized in terms of in country, and ideally also then subnational, using, for example, DHS data or mixed data. And then how can Indonesia? So Indonesia does already collaborate as a member of AREA. It's one of the founding members. Collaborates with AREA. So we frequently receive requests from different ministries. So for example, our partner is usually Kemenkes, the Ministry of Health. And so they might want advice on their 5-year strategy for non-communicable diseases or financing of aging. And so we work with them to develop either policy dialogues and then more concretely what areas of research to focus on. And the last question, how can Indonesia collaborate strengthen? Yeah, so that's not only Indonesia, that's also other ASEAN member state countries, as well as the other 6 countries, so Japan, Korea, China, and India, Australia, and New Zealand as area members. But we do work mostly then with the ministries, and we're hoping in the health unit to this year also expand our collaborations with academia. Because several of us come with academic backgrounds. So we work closely with institutes like the University of Tokyo in Japan. And then I'm hoping through this kind of initial lecture, we can work more closely with the University of Indonesia. Public health, we already work with some of the other departments at the University of Indonesia. We're also working with the university in Thailand. So again, it's context specific to go back to your first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. If Shuhei wants to add anything, go ahead.
I'd like to echo Sarah's comment. I totally agree with her. So localized approach is particularly important. You know, the disease structure, risk factor profiles is often different between the local places. For example, looking at Tokyo, which is the capital of Japan, and also the Osaka, which may be the second high population size prefecture, you know, the profile is different. There are some similarities, of course, but the priority should be different. And maybe local government also have a different priority. So the localized strategy is very important. That is true. And again, the data is important to understand how they are different.
Okay, thank you very much, Suhei. Let me ask the... Yes, Sarah asked, can you comment with keywords of your field of interest? Yeah, go ahead. But if you have questions, just raise your hand. You can ask directly, or if you're unsure of your question, you can put them in the chat first, and then you can read the question from there. So please go ahead. Yes, there's another question.
Beza, would you like to say the question yourself?
Yes, nudge me if you want to come forward and ask the question yourself.
Okay, I will. So, hi, Miss Sarah. I'm Faza from C class. And as you mentioned in your presentation before, that PAF studies have not yet been conducted in Indonesia. And in your opinion, what is the most influential factor contributing to this? And could you also describe the main challenges researchers might face when conducting such a survey? And additionally, is it possible to estimate Indonesia's PAF by referring to the PAF other countries that share similar heart issues? I think that's all from me. Thank you so much for this amazing session.
Thank you, Faiza, and also for your interest, because PAF is very important as a basis for the ministries for making these decisions in terms of where resources are allocated. So again, I'll try to go question by question. What is the most influential factor contributing PAF studies have not, why has it not been conducted? I think no one's taken the initiative. So we've tried with collaborators in South Asia, because I have some colleagues from Bangladesh, from Nepal, from India, to initiate a South Asian study first just for Bangladesh, and we actually got as far as drafting a manuscript for tobacco. So this is smoking tobacco and smokeless tobacco in the context of Bangladesh, which is a bit unique. We've submitted it to 10 journals and it was rejected. I think there's a bias from journals, less interest in the region, and that's really unfortunate. But the good news is there are also several journals focusing on Asia. The impact factor may be lower, but it's important to publish the work. So I think that's one of the points. I think the most difficult hurdle, though, that we found when we were trying to do the study in South Asia was the lack of data. So mortality data you can get, but for example, for cancer incidence, most of the countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, don't have a robust cancer registry, and so it's lacking reliable cancer incidence data. So we would have to borrow that cancer incidence data from neighboring countries, which also probably don't have it, or from the region, or from Japan, which probably has a pretty different structure, right, in terms of cancer incidence, site-specific incidence specifically. And in terms of the prevalence factors, so again, some of the data, like smoking, for example, there is some data from like WHO STEP surveys, but again, for nutrition aspect, it's quite limited to find nationally representative data. So there are some smaller studies with 200 participants or a localized study in Sumatra or something, but not for the nation as a whole. And since these PAF studies are nationally representative, it's hard to find actual data from the country, from Indonesia specifically. So you can borrow from the region, but we've already looked in South and Southeast Asia, and the data both for the prevalence of risk factors and the cancer incidence, if that's the outcome, is quite limited. And then the relative risk means that a study has to have been conducted looking at that risk factor with the cancer pair. So for example, salt intake and gastric cancer, less so important maybe in the context of Indonesia, but red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. But since there's no reliable registry, that data is also lacking. So a relative risk would have to be borrowed from the region or the global CAN data. So I can add that link in the chat box. Thank you. I hope that answered the question. Additionally, is it more possible to estimate Indonesia? Yes. So you can refer to other countries, but again, the risk factors may be different, and likely the outcomes distribution would also be different. So one needs to account for that it would be an estimate.
Right, thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much, Sarah. It's really well explained.
Okay, thank you for asking the question, Faza. I'm going to the next question. Leandra, do you want to come forward and ask the question yourself to Shuhei Nomura?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of introduction. Hi, I'm Leandra. I'm from Class B. Maybe I want to ask a question to Mr. Nomura. By the way, if Miss Sarah, if you want to answer the question, want to add in, feel free to answer. I heard that that you have to prioritize to which diseases that you need to like resolve the issue. My question is that have there been cases where, like, let's say the government failed to prioritize the health issues that is happening in a country, and how do these other stakeholders resolve the issue? Maybe that's my question. I hope you guys get it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is one, the Kuliah fail, which was also confirmed by the government of Japan. It was about the story of HPV vaccine. The Japan, actually had one of the lower levels of the vaccine confidence among countries worldwide. And this was, partially due to our previous experience with the HPV vaccine in 2013. It was more than 10 years ago when the fears about adverse events led to the suspension of proactive recommendation of the vaccine, which in turn resulted in the extremely low vaccine rate in Japan. That was the famous story of Japan's negative reaction to the public voice. Bunch of review and evidence show that HPV vaccine is important for the children, etc. But the government stopped its recommendation because of unconfirmed side event reported by the mass media. That is the one example. And recently, the government resumed its recommendation based on the bunch of internal discussion from the evidence of the effectiveness of HPV vaccine. But, it took about 10 years to resume the recommendation. Evidence was already showing that its importance and effectiveness more than 10 years ago. But this is very key. It took 10 years to, correct their strategies to the recommendation of the HPV vaccine. Voice from scientists, voice from academia is super important to negotiate with government people who are specialists on this topic. Is that correct answer to what do you think?
What do you think, Leandra?
I'm sorry. Okay, I understand the answer. Thank you, Mr. Nomura.
Another important point is that, I showed the ranking of mortality and deaths, but this is just one evidence. This is not directly related to the importance of the target or interventions. We are looking only mortality and disability, but there are lots of dimensions to consider, like economy aspect, also the happiness aspect, also the well-being, etc. So, GBD is very powerful, but this is just one of the two to negotiate with the people, policymakers. This is very important. GBD is not necessarily the gold standard of decision making. This is just one of them. That is the point.
All right. I hope that answers your questions, Leandra. Yes. Okay. All right. Any more questions? No? Any more questions? I can accommodate one more question before closing the session today. So if you have questions, please ask now before we close.
I just put additional details and potential data source in response to Tasha and Faiza's questions about PAF. And feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in conducting that kind of study. So I think one of the questions was also why it hasn't been done. So you need a very large research team we had 10, 12 experts, one for each risk factor. And it lasted around 8 years. So I think you need to have the capacity, the funding, the expertise, so particularly for infection, for the diet-related risk factors, to conduct this kind of study. So in addition to lack of quality data, I think there's enough motivation in Indonesia, but one needs to have a whole team to dedicate to this kind of work over multiple years. Rizga, maybe you can take that on.
Actually, I am not entirely sure why. Probably like the lack of data, and then I think this kind of study wasn't popular at least 10 years ago. And I think another issue is that we tend to collect like cross-sectional data. We collect one time, that's it, we leave, and we don't like keep our research sustainable. I think that's the weakness of in Indonesia regarding health. And we don't really have robust data. We would expect to have like morbidity, like mortality data is much better now. One of my students, she worked with the mortality data of Jakarta only, and it was really good, but we cannot find it anywhere else in Indonesia. And the reason for that is usually people who collect the data are also people who give the service, the health service, or for example, they're also nurses, they're also doctors. So it's just there's just too much things going on at the puskesmas for them to collect the data, or even the hospitals. I think that's the main problem, and I think pre-COVID, the government don't really prioritize data collection, and they're only starting to do that now after COVID. Yeah, I hope we can do more later on. And maybe I can collaborate with either Sarah or Shuhei or both of you together in the future. But first we have to find grant to do that. Anyway, we don't have that much time anymore, and I think the students, they still need to do a quiz. So I'll just close the session for today. And before we close, yes. Anyway, hang on. I think, can you do me a favor? Stella will add the time for the quiz, but can we just turn on our video for a moment and do a quick photo shoot? Stella, you can extend the quiz to later. It's okay. Yeah, just this is for me to report to the faculty, so they know that okay, we're actually doing this. All right, please turn on your video. I'll wait 5 more seconds, and then can someone help me take the screenshot? Is either Bintang, Satria, or anyone help with the photo?
Saya izin bantu ya, Bu.
Oh ya, makasih Bintang.
Ini ada 8 slide.
I
Slide 1.
I think just take the first. Yang
first
lain
aja.
satu orang.
Oke, 1, 2,
Semuanya,
3.
oh enggak. Yang lainnya boleh, tapi yang sampai nyala videonya aja. Okay. All right. Yes, I think if you're done, Bintang, let us know.
Udah, Bu.
Oh, yeah. Okay. She's done. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah and Shuhei. I think I plan to invite Sarah to the campus either next month or next month. So hopefully we can do more in-person sessions with Sarah. And Shuhei, I hope someday you can visit Indonesia. Maybe we can do a collaboration together. I don't know. We'll find out if there's something that we can do. Anyway, thank you very much to Sarah and Shuhei.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Yeah, and if you need to reach out to both of them, I think Sarah left her email somewhere. But if you want to ask any more questions after this, you can let me know and I can pass the questions to both of them. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, Sarah and Shuhei, you may leave. And some of the students, Bintang sama Stella titip kuisnya ya. I'll be leaving.